Ladies and gentlemen, joining me today is none other than Sean Madden of Elevation Fight Team, one of the busiest coaches in sports right now. I don't know if you know this or not, but the UFC has been holding events. Sean, as a coach who works at a gym full-time, I believe, is that accurate? Full-time?
Yes, yep.
Full-time at Elevation Fight Team with a large stable of fighters. With the coronavirus pandemic, how has that affected you and how did it affect the fighters?
Sure. It's been an uncertain time for all of us, just like it has been for everyone across the world. Obviously this is something new that we're all dealing with, and that's the same in the MMA community. Thankfully, Dina has done a good job in the UFC team of really adapting to this situation and pushing forward and giving our athletes the opportunity to still compete during this time. Personally myself, I was a little skeptical at the beginning when Dana said he was going to be having events. After we've gotten through this week, I think he's shown that it can work well during this time. And, for that reason, I'm grateful. And I know our staff, our athletes are grateful for that too, But to answer your question, to go back a little bit, there was definitely a time where we had to shut the gym down for a little bit, and technically it's still closed, right? But what we are doing now to accommodate is making sure the athletes that do have fights scheduled or potentially could be scheduled, they do have to prepare and they do have to train. So those guys that have one or two designated training partners each, they're not training with the entire team. And then there's one or two coaches at each session as well, So we're keeping these groups very small, sanitizing before and after these training sessions, making sure these guys are staying as safe and as healthy as possible. But at the end of the day, they still have a job to do. They still have to prepare to get ready for these fights. So we want to make sure we can do that to the best of our ability.
Absolutely. And I can definitely appreciate the steps that you guys are taking in order to make sure that obviously there's no way to make it entirely risk-free, but if an event is going on or if training is going on, to make it as safe as possible. Now, what we have heard from a lot of gym owners and a lot of coaches around the world, as these events have been unfolding, with gyms shut down, it can be very difficult financially. There are many gyms that have closed, particularly MMA, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, boxing gyms of that nature. Was there any period during the beginnings of the pandemic where you and the Elevation team thought, this could be very damaging for our gym?
Sure. That's a great question. I unfortunately have known a ton of gym owners who have been struggling through this time as well. One thing that is unique to Elevation, our situation here, and this is a little not as well known, is that Elevation Fight Team trains in basically two facilities. They train at martial arts academies. One is Easton Training Center, which is located in Denver, Colorado. And we have 7 locations over Colorado. And then one is our affiliate school, High Altitude Martial Arts, which is in Aurora, Colorado. So Elevation Fight Team itself does not have a standalone facility. It trains in these 2 martial arts academies. And there's a ton of benefits to go along with that, right? We have a huge member base with all of those locations. We have 50 plus jiu-jitsu black belts at these locations. Our athletes have access to all of those resources inside of the Easton and the High Altitude Network. So Elevation itself was not necessarily in danger financially or in the sense of these other businesses in terms of, overhead and expenses and maintaining a facility. Now, Easton and High Altitude, of course, they face those as well. Thankfully, we have a very strong membership base and we have very loyal and dedicated students who, most of them have continued to pay their memberships despite not having a place to train. And we've been in a situation where we're not necessarily worried about closing after this. So to that extent, we've been safe, thankfully. Always that, of course, could change tomorrow, the next week, in an hour, whatever it is. This is such a fluid situation. But in terms of that, Elevation is kind of tied directly to those guys in terms of where we train and how we train.
Absolutely. And I am having a bit of a technical issue with the Wi-Fi. So if anything were to happen there, please feel free to let me know. The Wi-Fi was a little bit shaky during the middle of that final answer, but we did hear the multiple locations. And obviously that can play a large role. Now, speaking of a large role within the Elevation Fight Team itself, I'd like to talk a little bit about your role with the team. Obviously, you are a striking coach, and as I was continuing to do my research, I'm familiar with your work. I'm familiar with, obviously, your athletes' work, so I think that's a very good way to get to know a coach is by watching their fighters. But I did go to Topology, and I was looking through the individuals they have listed with Elevation Fight Team, and they also list you as a spiritual leader. Is that something you can explain?
That's someone, one of the other coaches just having some fun with me on there. But back to your point there, we have a really fantastic group of coaches, and I think this is something that plays a big part of our success as Elevation Fight Team. Was we basically have 8 coaches on staff. So from the grappling side, we have Elliot Marshall, former UFC fighter and Ultimate Fighter vet. We have Cody Donovan, former UFC light heavyweight black belt. We have Peter Straub, former professional MMA fighter and black belt, and Valor Caballero, former professional MMA fighter and also a black belt. 4 grappling coaches there. On the striking side, we have Vinny Lopez, former pro MMA fighter. We have Christian Allen, who by all accounts is one of the best striking coaches in the game. He's also a multiple black belt in terms of jiu-jitsu, judo, a couple of the other striking arts. So he's one of the best kept hidden secrets in the game. I can talk about him more a little bit later. And then myself, one of the striking coaches. On the wrestling side, we have Dave Zabriskie, who was a multiple-time national champion. He wrestled at Iowa State. Dave's going to get mad at me for that one. But that's our staff. So we have 8 coaches total. And one of the really great benefits of that is that it allows our athletes to kind of pick and choose who they get to work with. It's definitely not one size fits all. Our athletes can even change their coaches from camp to camp if they need to, based on an opponent. Stylistically, they're able to use all of our coaches at any time. We are here for them. They are not here for us.
Absolutely. And one of the things that you mentioned there definitely strikes a chord with what just happened. And by what just happened, I mean the 3 UFC events in 8 days. Elevation Fight Team had 3 fighters, one on each event. A ridiculous lineup, a ridiculous workload for the fighters. And you mentioned the different styles, how fighters can tailor their camps towards specific opponents. What was it like to tackle 3 different Elevation fighters fighting 3 different opponents on 3 different days on 3 different events in an 8-day span? What was that like as a coach to kind of deal with all of those different scenarios in such a short amount of time?
Yeah, man, that's just part of this game that we play. It's so hectic. It could change at any second, and just another shout out to our coaching staff who does such a fantastic job of getting these guys ready. At the end of the day, Cody Donovan and Vinny Lopez, they handle kind of the bigger guys like Alistair and Curtis Blaydes. They prepared him. They put together his training sessions specifically for what Alistair needed. The lightweights, guys like Gaethje and Drew Dober, Dave Zabriskie, the wrestling coach, Oscar Martinez. He is Drew's striking coach, who is not necessarily a coach on Elevation Fight Team, but he helps Drew get ready for these fights, and he works with our coaching staff. And then Gaethje, has, of course, the mastermind Trevor Whitman, who's not a coach on our team, but, he has worked with a ton of our athletes before. He's worked with a ton of our coaches before they were coaches and while they were athletes, and he's done a fantastic job. He's obviously one of the brightest minds in the sport. So to have him in the room during these training sessions is just so invaluable to us. But to answer your question and go back just a little bit here, something that we found that was really successful during this time is that we almost shifted to a boxing training camp type of mentality. So if you see in boxing, right, boxers will tend to bring sparring partners in. They have a much smaller room around them in terms of training partners and coaches, right? Whereas if you look at someone, let's say ATT, for example, who has a ton of athletes, they have a ton of coaches too, right? But it's a very big room. It's a very different feel than a boxing training camp would be, right? So we didn't necessarily bring partners in, but like I said earlier, these guys had 1 or 2, maybe 3 designated training partners that they used for the entire camp. And then they had a group of 1 to 2 to 3 coaches who were watching over their entire camp and kind of really managing everything. So these guys got a ton of extra individual attention for these fights, which I think is one of the main keys that allowed us to be very successful in those 3 outings.
Certainly, and I'd like to go a little bit more in depth on each individual fight for each individual Elevation Fight team member, if you don't mind. So, of course, starting at the top with the first event that took place during that busy 8-day week, I should say, and that was obviously Justin Gaethje defeating Tony Ferguson, snapping that illustrious winning streak of Ferguson's to become the UFC interim lightweight champion. Now, that's a fight that did materialize on short notice. And of course, during the COVID pandemic, everything feels like it's short notice. But when that fight was brought about, how was the gym kind of adapting to a Tony Ferguson type challenge? What were the preparations for Gaethje in that fight?
I think anytime preparing for someone like Tony, man, is a tough task, right? You know, he's such an unpredictable fighter in certain ways, right? We've seen Tony's training methods. We see his mentality. We see how he fights. He's a very difficult fighter to get ready for, right? You know, but something else that makes our team so successful is that our guys, when they're not fighting, are in the gym helping our guys get ready for their fights. And if need be, imitating someone like Tony, you know? So, you know, Gaethje had everything he needed from the sparring partners to the coaches to prepare him specifically for this fight, you know, and, you know, we saw that he brought out Beneil Dariush and he brought out Kamaru Usman, and they trained with him for a little bit as well to help him get ready for this fight. And I would say both of those guys did a phenomenal job and Beneil in particular, you know, really giving Justin some really good looks, very similar to how Tony fights. So, you know, we did the best we could with the guys that we had, and they adapted, they improvised, and, you know, we saw the results a couple Saturdays ago.
Yeah, we absolutely did see that result that Saturday, and obviously the result ended with Justin Gaethje's hand being raised. But one of the things that I'd like to discuss is specifically about Gaethje. Now, in World Series of Fighting, as he became an undefeated champion, we saw a very different fight than we see today in a lot of respects. Now, obviously, it's the same fighter with the same power, with the same abilities, but there has been a shift in the game plan since he's transitioned over to the UFC. What can you say from an elevation perspective on the ways in which Gaethje has evolved as the fights have gone on?
Sure. I think, in my eyes, I give two things credit here. First and foremost, Trevor Whitman. You know, I'll say it till I'm blue in the face. He's a genius. He's been in this sport for such a long time. He has such a great eye for developing these guys, you know, in reinventing an athlete like Justin, you know, who's fought so many times and has had some high profile losses. That's a very tough thing to do. We don't see that very often in this sport, you know, so a ton of credit goes to Trevor. I would say the second one is his training partners. You know, those guys have really brought the best out of Justin and forced him to adapt. When you have so many high level guys in that room, you know, you're going to get better as a result of that, you know. In terms of our lightweights, right, Drew Dober, who just cracked the top 15 now with that great performance of Alex. We have Austin Hubbard, who's another one of our lightweights in the UFC. Phenomenal kid, really talented. We're just seeing him start to come into his own here. We have Carrington Banks, who is one of our LFA guys and is very close to getting signed to the UFC right now. Lavelle Simpson. All of these guys are very high-level lightweights, you know, that Justin trains with on a regular basis, and they all forced him to get a lot better. Specifically in terms of what we saw are the big differences, I think, with Justin, come down to his feet and come down to his eyes. I think those have been stylistically the two biggest changes we've seen. Trevor's done a great job of training Justin to use his feet to get in position to land more effective strikes and to also be in better position when he's taking shots so he can return with something. We saw that really well in the Tony fight. And then the other one is just seeing shots coming at him. You know, he's done a much better job of positioning himself to see strikes coming his way so he can either defend or he can return something at the same time. And we've seen those results play out in these last couple of fights when he's gotten early finishes. That 100% comes down to his foot position and being able to see what's available to him.
Absolutely. And of course, Justin did get his hand raised at the end of that fight. And am I correct in assuming that that is the first champion for Elevation Fight Team in the UFC?
That is, yeah. So going back a little bit, you know, Elevation started in 2013. At that time, I think the only title fight, I believe TJ was training with us for one of his title defenses. And then Kat Zingano fought Ronda, and that was for a title fight. But obviously that one, she didn't get the belt there. So this is our first successful championship, correct?
Absolutely. And as a coach to Gaethje and the rest of the Elevation team, and as the team itself, what was the general feel when Gaethje captured that title? I would imagine that it's much more than being a fan of someone watching or covering the sport, because there's a lot of camaraderie there, blood, sweat, and tears put into that mat. What was the feeling like for you to watch Gaethje win that title?
Man, I was so happy. You know, I was watching the fight with one of our other coaches, Peter Straub, and you know, we were just so happy after the fight, calling our guys, you know, texting, just, you know, sharing that feeling of excitement. You know, like you said, these guys are just so invested in each other, the blood, the sweat, and the tears that they put into preparing each other for these fights. To see something like that pay off is so worth it for them. You know, but at the same time, none of us were surprised. We knew. I would say the only thing we were surprised about maybe was the finish in the 5th round, but we knew Justin was going to finish him. I guess we didn't know necessarily when, so we weren't surprised at the outcome, but we were just overly excited that it finally came to fruition.
Yeah, and it did come to fruition, and what a fight it was. I can't think of a better way to get that first title than the way that it did happen. Obviously, Gaethje's win, while it was amazing, was not the only one for Elevation Fight Team. You had Drew Dober crack into the top 15 at lightweight, and then Alistair Overeem later. But I do want to talk about the Dober fight specifically, because he, like Gaethje, is another one of these fighters who, under Elevation, has come into his own. He's really found his stride. I believe he's won his last 3 fights by knockout. Is that accurate?
Yep.
So can you talk to me a little bit about what Dober's camps have been like, and the ways in which Dober has kind of progressed under Elevation?
Sure. Yeah. I think the big thing that we're seeing with Drew right now is really finally being able to put all of his skills together and execute on fight night. And then in my opinion, that really comes down to having control of your mind and your mentality. Drew is a perfect example right now of someone really coming into their prime, where all of those things are firing on all cylinders. You know, his skill level is there. Obviously, he's an extremely talented fighter. You know, he has the experience. I don't know, that was maybe his 15th, 16th fight in the UFC, something like that, you know, aside from his previous experience before that in MMA and Muay Thai. And, you know, and then just mentally, you know, he's finally in a spot. I believe he's 31 years old now, you know, and he's just really starting to kind of put all this stuff together, have confidence in his abilities, you know, and really be present on fight night. So we have the pleasure right now of getting to witness that in the cage, you know, and these last couple of performances have really spoke for themselves.
Absolutely. And the Hernandez fight was a pivotal one for Dober. Obviously, Hernandez was ranked 15th at the time. With the win, Dober has now moved into those rankings. How did you game plan for a fighter like Alexander Hernandez? Obviously, a very talented wrestler, a very strong individual who, as we saw with the fight with Dariush, does possess a lot of power. How did you kind of reconcile Dober's game against those kinds of hybrid threats?
Sure. You know, I thought in this fight, you know, and really in the majority of Drew's fights, he tends to be the shorter fighter, right? So his style has to be a pressure-based style. He has to move to get inside. He has to punch with guys and not after them or before them, you know, in order to kind of close that gap. And he's got to press guys to the outside of the fence and take away their ability to move. And he executed all of those things in the Hernandez fight to a T, you know? So having a game plan like that shows how you can stifle someone who's so diverse as an Alex Hernandez, who has so many weapons, you know, striking, grappling, whatever it is. Drew was he was able to neutralize all of those with that game plan, you know? So that's a big shout out to Oscar Martinez and Dave Zabriskie for putting that game plan together. You know, Drew is a pressure fighter, you know, and he's more than comfortable if he needs to take a couple of shots to get inside to where he needs to be to land that shot that's going to hurt someone. But we saw it in that last fight. He did just a fantastic job of executing that game plan, which tends to be a lot of his fights. So that was just a phenomenal effort by him.
Absolutely. Now, cracking into the top 15, I believe the post-fight call-out, respectful as it may be, was for Paul Felder. Is that correct?
That was it, yep.
And I know as a striker yourself and a striking coach now, that's a fight that's got to get your blood going.
I love that matchup for Drew. Absolutely. And for the fans.
Absolutely. And of course, Felder is a markedly different fighter than Alexander Hernandez. So as Dober prepares for his next fight, whether it be Felder or not, if it were to be Felder, what kinds of things would you focus on in camp that, for example, you may not have for a fighter like Hernandez, who has different skill sets than Felder does?
Sure. Without giving away too much, in terms of a specific game plan, Drew's goal for that fight was just to go out and show that he's the better MMA fighter all around, right? On paper, we both know that would be a phenomenal striking fight. But at the end of the day, this is the UFC. This is mixed martial arts, not Muay Thai or kickboxing, right? And these guys need to use all of their skills in their game plan to have the best chance of winning, So I think we would be able to see a very well-rounded Drew Dober in that fight. We'd be able to see a smart Drew Dober, pick his shots, be in the pocket when he needs to be moving when he needs to be, fitting in when Paul is coming forward, getting the takedown, staying on top, giving that pressure like we talked about earlier. But I think in that fight, we would be able to really see a fully well-rounded and how truly skilled Drew Dober is as a mixed martial artist.
Absolutely. And of course, going back to an interview that you had done before the UFC events started coming with the Fight Site, Ben Cohn, Brian Wagner, a lot of technical discussion there talking about fighting in the transitions and winning transitions and being able to mix your martial arts well together in order to be, well, a good mixed martial artist. So I can definitely see where you're coming from there. But obviously, now that we've covered Gaethje and Dober, there is, of course, the Alistair Overeem fight. And the Alistair Overeem story for me is such a great one because he fights Curtis Blaydes. That fight doesn't go his way. And then he accepts Curtis Blaydes' offer to come to train with the Elevation Fight Team. And since then, I mean, he's looked great. The fight with Harris, can you tell me how you guys kind of approached that fight?
Sure. That fight has been in the works for quite some time now, so we've had some time obviously to prepare for that and game plan around that fight. That credit goes all to Cody Donovan, Christian Allen, and Vinny Lopez for really putting that game plan together, and Dave Zabriskie as well with the wrestling. But they did a phenomenal job of kind of dissecting Walt as a very good athlete, a dangerous striker, very explosive, and then, taking into account Alistair's experience in the cage, his strengths as well. He has extremely underrated grappling. Maybe not that underrated. People know he's a fantastic grappler, but something that Cody Donovan has done really well is developed a fantastic ground and pound system for our guys. You probably remember in the fight where we saw that wrist ride position that Alistair was using on Walt to do a lot of damage in the first round. Cody has done a really good job of building that system for our guys and working it to fit not only our big guys like Curtis and Alistair, who you've seen use that to success in their fights, but our smaller guys as well. So yeah, the game plan, like you saw, was to take him down, right? The longer you stay standing with any of these heavyweights, the more chance you have of getting hurt, and taking advantage of the fight on the ground there. So it played out exactly how they wanted it to play out. It was a fantastic game plan by those elevation coaches. And yeah, we got the result that we were looking for.
Absolutely. And one of the things that always fascinates me when I watch a fight is when there's a momentum change in between rounds. Now, obviously, the first round was not ideal for Overeem. He was rocked, dropped to the ground, and then there was a lot of ground and pound. And right off the Wednesday event where we saw Anthony Smith, Glover Teixeira, and that referee stoppage attracted a lot of flack. It was a very interesting parallel, so to speak, with a different outcome. But when Overeem goes back to his corner, he comes out for the second round, and then he secures the finish, dropping Harris and finishing Harris on the ground. So can you describe to me what the mentality is of a corner? I know you weren't cornering specifically for that fight, but you have cornered in the past. I believe in the Fight Side interview, you said 75 fights over the past year. So can you talk a little bit about what changes in between rounds? What do you say to a fighter there to turn it around, and specifically with the Overeem situation?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a couple factors that go into play here. First of all, I would like to say, I would like to give a shout out to the ref, Dan Mergliata. those coaches from Elevation told me when they were out there for the fight, and then Dan walked into the locker room before the fight to give instructions, they kind of looked and went, oh man, here we go again, right? Because if you recall in December when Alistair fought Rosenstruck, Dan was the same ref, so it sounded like they acknowledged that in the back, and Dan said he was going to let him work tonight, and to his credit, he did a fantastic job of letting that fight play out exactly how it should have. And like we said, Wednesday, right, with Herzog, and then earlier in the week with Peterson with Dominick Cruz, right? Man, reffing is probably the toughest job in the world. Overall, I think you have to look at a ref's body of work more than just one instance, but it's a very tough job to do that. So hats off to those guys. Going back to what we talked about here in terms of the corner, right? Alistair having so much experience, I think, is something that's really important in this situation, right? With the amount of fights that he has, he's been in these situations before. He knows how he can turn the tide to come out in the second round and make the adjustments that he needs. So that alone plays such a big part in this situation. But the other thing goes into fantastic coaching, just like we talked about. Cody Donovan got in there in the corner. He calmed him down. And a big thing here, when we have a hectic round before us, is we have to, one, kind of forget that round, right? It's important to be able to compartmentalize these rounds, especially if we have a bad one before. We need to not dwell on that too much. We have to let it go, and we have to focus on 2 and 3 going forward, and that comes down to just the discipline to the game plan. Cody said, we got to go get there. We got to go take him down, right? We have to get on top and do some damage. And Alistair did exactly that. He hurt him with the head kick, and he took advantage, and he followed up, and we saw the result, So one, Alistair's experience plays a big role in this, but two, you have to have a coach who has the experience and knows what he's doing in there. I thought Cody did a really, really great job of keeping Alistair focused and disciplined to the game plan in between rounds.
Absolutely. And of course, that's Overeem's win. And now he has said that he will be retiring at the end of his upcoming contract. There are 4 fights left there. Assuming he continues there and he stays with Elevation, as obviously he would, what fights would you like to see for Alistair? Obviously, he wants to go back to the top. He wants to go to that final elusive UFC title shot. Who would you like to see Alistair fight in his next 4?
Sure. Yeah. It's the heavyweight division right now is a little interesting. I think we both know that with Stipe and DC, trying to figure out when they're going to finish their trilogy up, get this division moving again. Obviously, we have Francis waiting in the wings right there. We have Curtis, who's right behind him, so we kind of have to get this thing moving again a little bit. But in the meantime, with Alistair, kind of where he's at, I think a Derrick Lewis fight makes sense for him. I think we've been trying to get that fight for a while now. And I know Derrick had surgery a while back on his knee, and, for whatever reason, it hadn't worked. It seems to be a good matchup right now. I don't think Derrick has a fight coming up. I don't think he has one. Alistair's fresh off this win. That's something that we could definitely see maybe at the end of the summer or early fall. I think that would be a logical next step, especially given the fact that Curtis is supposed to be fighting Volkov next month, but we're not 100% certain on that still. So in my opinion, I think the Derrick Lewis fight makes sense, at least for the next step right now.
Absolutely. And of course, that does bring up a very interesting question that I like to pose to coaches or gyms who have multiple fighters in the same division. Of course, Alistair wants that final title shot. He wants that last crack at the elusive title that he has yet to win over his illustrious career. Then you have Curtis Blaydes, who's currently ranked 3rd, and he's maybe second in line because obviously they're trying to make the DC trilogy. Then you've got to give it to Francis based on what he's done. And then you have Curtis. So that's someone who is very close to the title. And then, of course, as we were saying, Gaethje now is the interim champion, and Drew Dober has entered the rankings. How does it work in a gym when you have 2 guys who are close to contention in the same division? Are there any kinds of discussions that take place should one win the title, or if they were to fight in conflicting ways? Sure.
Yeah, and that's a great question. We've seen in the past, and even this last week, right, when Arlovsky fought Philippe Lenz, that was ATT versus ATT, not even for a title, so some of these gyms are totally fine with it. They had main coaches on both sides of that fight cornering against each other. Our philosophy at Elevation, especially for a fight like that, we would be 100% against it, right? A title fight has a little bit more implication, right? Obviously, there's more money at stake there. Both athletes are going to get paid pretty well, you know, and someone's going to come out with the title. You know, I think generally we're very against our teammates fighting each other. You know, we have a strong chemistry in this room that's built by these guys being great teammates to each other, and having two guys have to compete against each other and us having to separate the room really drives a wedge into that chemistry. Now, look, let's say maybe it's Alistair's last fight, his fourth fight on the contract, and all of a sudden him and Curtis are going to fight for the title. Maybe they talk about it. You know, I think it's going to come down to a vote and how those guys feel, you know, but I would say maybe that's the only exception where Alistair is not going to fight again after that. You know, I think it would be, you know, a very rare instance. In terms of Drew and Gaethje, I don't see that happening, or any of our other guys. You know, I think we just value our team and our friendship so much that we're not going to let anything get in the way of that, including UFC title. But like I said, when the time comes, we can discuss that. All of those guys have a couple fights ahead of them right now, before we start talking about that. So we'll focus on those for now.
Yeah, I can definitely respect that, and I would imagine that the fighters would as well. Obviously, now we've gotten to the end of that hectic 3-event, 8-day period, but we are going to look to the future for Team Elevation. One of the guys who stands out, I know you have a very close bond with him, and he's a staple of the gym, is Cory Sandhagen, and he's right in the mix for that allegedly vacant bantamweight title, with Henry Cejudo reportedly stepping away from the sport in the middle of his athletic prime. We still have yet to see there. Obviously, his manager, Ali Abdelaziz, has said that he will be back in fighting, but Dana White has said that if the retirement holds, it will be Peter Yan versus someone. Now, assuming that it's Sandhagen, how would you see that fight playing out? And then, of course, we'll talk about if Sandhagen isn't the one to get that opposite slot of Yan.
Sure. Yeah, man. You know, first of all, Yan is a very tough opponent. You know, he's a big puncher. He's very well-rounded. Those guys over at Tiger Muay Thai, George Hickman and Frank and all those guys have done a great job, you know, training Pieter and getting him ready for these fights. I think over 5 rounds, you know, Cory is just so hard to hit, man. You know, Yan likes to be in the pocket. He likes guys sitting there with him. That's how he hits guys and hurts them. Cory is just so dynamic on the feet in terms of his angles, his footwork, his distance, the strikes that he's throwing. It's just so hard to get going against Cory. You see these guys that have fought him, and it just looks like, man, they just can't get started. They can't get started. They can't put something together, and all of a sudden, 3 rounds is over, and Cory's way ahead on the cards. I think in a 5-round fight, which we haven't seen Cory in the UFC yet, we find the same thing, except Cory either finds a finish or the gap just gets so wide after 5 rounds, you know, that he runs away with it. You know, a lot of these guys rely on people standing in front of them and trading with them to get the better of them, you know, and they're going to rely on their strength and their power to do damage. And it's very hard to do that when you have someone like Cory who's hitting you and he's taking an angle after that, or he's gone and you can't throw anything. It's just very hard to get going against someone like that. And that's kind of how I see that fight playing out.
Absolutely. And personally, I would love that fight. But then again, I love any fight that's booked at the top of bantamweight. It's such a stacked division. Now, there are a lot of other fighters who are in the mix for that vacant title belt title shot. And obviously, you have your Peter Yan, you have Marlon Moraes, you have Sandhagen, Dominick Cruz, who's now back in the mix after fighting Cejudo, Cejudo himself, and Jose Aldo, who was supposed to fight Cejudo before visa issues led to his withdrawal. Let's say that Sandhagen isn't the one to get that title shot. Who would you like for him to fight out of that group, and how do you see that fight playing out?
Sure. I think any of the guys ahead of him makes the most sense right now. You know, Cory's number 4. Is Yan? I believe Yan's 3. Aljo is 2. Marlon is 1. You know, I think the fight with, you know, Aljamain makes a lot of sense. You know, he's had a ton of great fights in the UFC. He's earned his position at number 2, 100%. Fantastic fighter. You know, I think for Cory to get a fight like that and really showcase the level that he's on, you know, he beat Lineker, he beat Assunção, you know, and for whatever reason, he's still flying under the radar a little bit, which is fine. But beating a guy who's in the number 2 spot, who has a good name in that division and who's beaten some of the top guys in the past and is in the conversation for the title, contendership, that puts Cory right in the mix, and it really, you kind of run out of arguments for Cory not fighting for the title after beating someone like an Aljamain or a Marlon ahead of him, So that would be our goal, is one of those two, we go get that win and then we fight Jan after that for the title later this year.
Absolutely. And of course, there were talks between Sandhagen, Dominick Cruz, and Aljamain Sterling, all at various stages of being official. The fight with Cruz was supposed to happen over in California, and then a fight with Sterling was supposed to materialize. Has there been anything from the UFC on Sandhagen's next fight, or is it right now waiting for things to shake out?
This week was kind of the defining moment for what is going to be happening next. So you guys should be getting some news really soon here on what that's going to look like. I don't know if it has been announced, so I'm not going to announce it yet. But it looks like we're going to be moving forward next month with a fight. So I think things are going to start to kind of play out how we just talked in terms of what's going on in the bantamweight division.
So there has been something offered, there has been something signed, and it's just not public yet?
We're just waiting on the announcement.
Gotcha. Okay. And then moving on to another guy from Elevation who is in title contention, that is Curtis Blaydes. Obviously, He had the fight with Volkov scheduled. That event was canceled due to COVID-19. Do you see that fight being rebooked, or is that something that we're just waiting on the UFC's to make official?
Yeah, we're trying to rebook that one right now. Volkov makes sense for Curtis too. He's another guy who's kind of cleared out the majority of the names in the division. Unfortunately, the guys ahead of him, Francis, he lost to twice. And DC and Stipe, we have to figure that thing out still. So, the best thing that he can do right now is stay busy and really just clear out everyone else behind him. So when his time comes for the title shot, there is no other argument, and Volkov is a guy he hasn't fought yet. It's a good matchup. Volkov's obviously a name in the division, a dangerous striker. So I think that makes perfect sense for Curtis. We're just working on trying to figure out when that fight is actually going to happen.
Absolutely. And one final fighter from Elevation before we move on to some other topics is Neil Magny. And that's someone who looked great in his last fight. After the loss to Ponzinibbio, there was a long layoff with USADA implications, and that's a whole nother story for a whole nother day. But Magny was able to return, and he looked sensational against Li Jingliang. Can you talk a little bit about Magny's return to action and the ways in which that facilitated itself?
Sure. Yeah, that's it's a great story for Neil. And anyone on the UFC roster, really. He got dealt a really bad hand with the USADA stuff. And there's a couple different ways you can go about handling that situation and the time off. And in my eyes, Neil did exactly what you're supposed to do. He dealt with the USADA stuff. He worked through it. He got his name cleared finally, and all that while he was still continuing to improve as a fighter. That was the longest layoff Neil has ever taken in his career. And there's a very foreign thing to him. Guys like that have a tendency when they're so active to just want to get back in there. But a lot of times when you're fighting so much too consistently, it's hard to build skill in between. So what we saw with Neil in this time with that long layoff is that he was able to add some new tools to his game, change his mentality and his mindset a little bit. And man, he came out on fire against Lee, and he really halted a guy who was kind of streaking and building momentum in that division. That was a fantastic performance by Neil. I was super happy to see how he performed in that fight, So he's just taking that momentum now. He's continuing to get better. He's always in the gym. He's helping his teammates get ready, and he's looking for his next opportunity soon too.
Right, and you mentioned Li Jingliang was a streaking fighter, building momentum with a lot of wins under his belt in recent months. And now Magny appears to be calling for a fight with someone who also matches that description, which is Michael Chiesa. Can you talk a little bit about the way that you and Magny and Elevation would approach a fight with Chiesa, who is remarkably different than Jingliang?
Yeah, very different opponent. Chiesa is a very tricky fighter. He's very well-rounded. Obviously he's got phenomenal grappling. He's big for the weight class, even at 70. I cannot believe how he ever made 55. And I know he missed a couple of times, but man, he's big for 70. When we fought in Raleigh in January, when Curtis fought and one of our other guys, Darko Stojic, fought. We shared a locker room with Chiesa, and I was like, man, like I've met Chiesa before around the scene, but seeing him get ready for his fight and warm up in the back, I was like, man, he's a solid welterweight. So but the nice thing about Neil is he's got the longest reach in the division. He's able to really control guys well on the feet with that jab and his length when he's using it effectively. And Neil has some very underrated grappling too. One of the biggest things that Neil has to his advantage too is his endless gas tank. We've seen him take fights on short notice, 5 rounds against Kelvin in the past, and we've seen the pace that he can put on guys even in the 3-round fight. So I think that's something Neil would look to use to his advantage in that fight, dictate the pace, dictate the range of the fight, control where that fight takes place, and, look to kind of just drown his opponent or drown Chiesa at that pace.
Absolutely, and that's a fight I'd definitely like to see. Moving on now from specific fighters from Elevation Fight Team, I'd like to get your perspective on a couple of the bigger stories coming out of that 8-day week concerning coaches and concerning corners. And we touched on it earlier, but the referees and the corners in action in that Glover Teixeira and Anthony Smith fight has led to a lot of discussion about the role of a cornerman and the role of a coach. Obviously, the coaches did not throw in the towel for that fight. A lot of people were asking for that, but the reaction has been on both sides. You have Anthony Smith saying that's ridiculous to call for that and that his coaches did exactly what he would, even going as far as to say that he would have fired his coaches if they would have thrown in the towel. And then, of course, referee Jason Herzog, he stepped up and took responsibility for his actions, to which Smith replied that that was a coward's move and that he was caving into pressure from the media, from the public. How do you stand on the role of a cornerman and throwing in the towel in MMA?
Sure. It's a good question. There's a lot of variables that go into this. I'll kind of briefly touch on that situation and then kind of move off of that. First of all, Anthony's doing exactly what he should be doing, right? As an athlete, he's going to defend his coach's choice. He wants to fight until he's out all the way. I understand that, right? That fighters fight. That's their job, right? You hear countless times in the back room before a fight when the ref's talking to the athlete, and the athlete's going to say, let me go out, right? And that's just the mentality, and that has to be your mentality going into the cage. We saw that in the interviews before the Justin and Tony fight where Gaethje says, I can't trust myself to save myself in the cage, right? And that's exactly what Trevor is there for, is to protect me from myself, and I thought they really nailed it on that one, right? That's the coach's responsibility, is to protect the athlete. The athlete's safety should come first and foremost. Secondly, Jason Herzog, I don't think it was his fault. I think everything that he asked for, Anthony gave him. Anthony did just enough to stay in that fight to prevent Jason from stopping the fight. Anytime Jason gave a warning, asking for improved position or something, Anthony gave him enough to work with to allow the fight to continue. So, we talked about that earlier. Referees do have a tough job. I thought Jason did a great job in this instance. He's one of the more experienced and well-respected referees. I like him a lot as a referee. I thought he did a good job. I don't think he needed to come out with an apology to the public. I thought he did fine, but that's his prerogative. I think there's something really tricky that goes into play here, and it's just the money that is involved in MMA and combat sports, right? Right? Coaches become basically, how do I say this? They're in service to the athlete, right? And that can work good ways and it can work bad ways. When money gets involved like that, you're going to want to do what the athlete wants you to do, so you make sure you get paid, and I hate saying that, but that's the unfortunate reality of part of this sport, is that money dictates a lot of things. I'm not saying that was their motivation for that decision. I'm saying that just based on observation for what I'm seeing over the years with coaches in all combat sports. It could have been a factor in this. I don't know. I know personally, if I was in that situation, you have to look at all the possibilities that athlete has to potentially still win the fight. If I feel like my athlete doesn't have statistically any probability of winning this fight, then there's no reason for us to keep taking damage and we live to fight another day. And look, it's a tough spot to be in, and that's probably a conversation you have to have before the fight before we even get to that point, you know. But man, you have to be comfortable being able to get fired in that position. Unfortunately, look, I'm not in that position. I can't speak to that. I'm not going to say they did wrong, they did right. There's so many variables that go into that. I know if you look at Mark Montoya and James Krause, their body of work overall speaks for themselves. You know, they have a ton of success on the local and at the high level in MMA. So unfortunately, I think this situation also kind of got it almost got magnified by the fact that Trevor did such a good job a couple nights before, and everyone was heaping praise on Trevor for his corner work. And then now 4 days later, we had this in the main event too. So it was almost a bit of a double down in that situation, you know. Going back, my personal opinion is, you know, the coach's job is to protect the athlete. And if you feel like there's not a way out of this fight and we're taking extra damage, then yeah, we live to fight another day. There's life outside of fighting in the cage. And you know, most of these guys have a family that they go home to afterwards. You have to make sure that, okay, if we don't statistically have a way to keep winning this fight or find a way to win this fight, then we're done here. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah, it's a very difficult issue and a very nuanced one. So to come up with a one-size-fits-all policy really doesn't work here. You have, like you mentioned, the win bonus, in which half the purse is withheld until a fighter wins. That's a factor for both the fighter and the coach. There's also the fighter's mentality, where it's with your shield or on it. So you have that kind of mentality as well. There's many factors there. So I very much appreciate that insight. Does Elevation Fight Team have a policy for throwing in the towel, or is that something that's tailored per fighter and discussed with that specific corner?
Yeah, it's a case-to-case basis. You know, I think that's a conversation that you have to have with your coaches. I think that's a part of, you know, really developing a bond with your coach too, and knowing your fighter intimately and knowing where they are in the fight and how much more they have left to give, you know. But you can also look at a fighter inside of a fight when they're sitting on the stool. You can look at their body language and their posture. You can look into their eyes and you can tell if they have a little bit left in them or if they have nothing all left in them, you know, and then you can make that decision. You know, look, we saw it in the Wilder Fury fight, right? And there was a lot more money on the line in that fight than there was in any of these MMA fights. And his coach threw the towel in, and he was okay with the criticism that came after that. So it can be done, you know. You know, but like you and I said, I think it's just, there's so much gray in that. It's a tough area to talk about, and I think it has to just be a coach and athlete discussion before fights, you know, and you have to know your athlete at that level to be able to make that call.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for your time. I have one final question, and then I'd like to try out a little bit of an exercise, because it's very rare that I get to speak with a coach with your level of insight. So I'd like to try something at the end. But one final question is, we've talked about everything that has happened with Elevation and some of the bigger names who may have fights coming up. But is there anyone that we need to keep our eye on? Are there any prospects who stand out to you? Anyone you've been working with who's been hitting the pads a little harder than you thought or moving a little bit quicker than usual? Is there anyone we should keep our eye on from Elevation?
Yeah, man, we have a whole host of guys, you know, like I love that our UFC guys get to shine, right? But at the end of the day, and they'll be the ones to tell you, they get better with the other UFC guys that are helping them. And then the guys that aren't in the UFC are the ones pushing them too, most of the time, you know. We have a tremendous amount of guys who are kind of right on that cusp, who, you know, maybe 1 or 2 wins away from getting that call and making the jump up to the UFC. Carrington Banks, who I talked about earlier, he's one of our lightweight guys. You know, his last fight was in LFA. He won down in Albuquerque against a high-level prospect down there. He's one of Justin's main training partners. He's one of Cory's main training partners. You know, we almost had an opportunity for him in February on the Houston card. It didn't end up panning out, but he is on the UFC's radar. He's a phenomenal wrestler. He's a very good striker. He's been in the game a long time. Lavelle Simpson, another one of our lightweight guys. Matt Jones, featherweight, phenomenal striker, very talented. We have Anthony Adams at middleweight, who is going to be on the Contender Series in July. That'll be his second time on the Contender Series. We have Ty Flores, who's a light heavyweight, who will be on Contender Series coming up here in June. He's one of Alistair and Curtis's main training partners. And man, we have actually a killer group of ladies on our team. They don't get enough credit. They have a really really solid group of ladies that train. We have Mallory Martin, who's in the UFC. She's a strawweight. We have Shauna Danger Dobson, who's a women's flyweight in the UFC. She just moved to us last December, I believe. So she's new to the team. She's one of my favorites. She's awesome. We're just kind of getting to know her and getting her into the swing of things here. But we have such a good group of girls. Claire Guthrie, who's in Invicta, she's also a flyweight. You know, we have this huge stable of fighters who are just under that level, who really push our A-level guys to be better, and they get better in the process too. So, you know, this year, next year, you're going to see a lot more names from Elevation joining the UFC roster.
Absolutely, and we'll definitely keep our eye on that. And now for the final exercise, if you will indulge me, I'd like to build the perfect fighter. So I will give you a category, and if you could you give me the fighter's attribute that you would attribute to that individual? So, for example, how are we starting off this fighter? With fight IQ. Which fighter's fight IQ, past or present, would you put in the perfect fighter?
Sure. I love these, man. This is awesome. Fight IQ, I'm going to give it to Dan Hooker. He's trained with us before here. You know, he did a couple of camps with Elevation Fight Team. So we have a cool relationship with the City Kickboxing guys. I learned a ton from Dan at his time here. And I know those City guys well. That's something that they are really big on. And Dan in particular is just that fight IQ and being able to read guys and make reads and get 1, 2, 3, 4 steps ahead. So fight IQ for sure goes to Dan Hooker.
Got it. Whose boxing are we adding?
Boxing. Are we talking MMA boxing? Are we talking pure boxing? What kind of fighter are we building here? Just all around?
Right. We're building a perfect MMA fighter. We're going to do boxing, then kicks, then elbows, knees, clinch, offensive and defensive wrestling, submissions, heart, and chin. If you've got the time.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, boxing, man. Let me see. Let's go with McGregor. I love his you know, pressure counter fighting game. You know, he's such a sniper with the left hand. He does a good job of using the right hand to stay busy too. You know, so in terms of his accuracy and his power with his punching specifically in MMA, we're going to go with Conor.
Yeah, Conor's definitely up there for a lot of people. I mean, we've seen what he can do, and it's pretty much unmatched. Now, moving on to the kicks. Now, I understand this can be a difficult one, but whose kicks would you assign to the perfect fighter?
I'm going to have to go with Edson. You know, I think Edson's just one of the most dangerous kickers in the game. He's so explosive. When you have that many finishes by low kick or spin kick, you know, it shows that you're a real threat with those. His speed and his explosiveness on his kicks is just from another world. So I think Gaethje said that's the hardest he's ever been kicked for sure. So we're going to go with Edson for the kicks.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to go wrong with Edson there. Now moving on to the elbows. Whose elbow strikes are we adding to the perfect fighter?
Let's go with Matt Brown, former also Elevation Fight Team member. You know, he has phenomenal clinch. And if you remember from my Fight Side interview, that's something that I said that there's still quite a bit of opportunity in MMA to develop the standing clinch game in the open and against the fence. But Matt has shown time and time again his ability to use the elbows in the clinch and in the open. And he's got phenomenal elbows. And that's credit to his coach, Dorian Price, who's a American Muay Thai OG. So shout out to Dorian for that. But yeah, Matt Brown for the elbows.
Right. And obviously this next category, it may bleed over. Whose clinch are we adding to the perfect fighter?
Matt, yeah, you know, Matt's going to probably take that title too. He's got phenomenal clinch. Although, someone that I would like to add that we still haven't seen a ton of, but we are going to see more of it. And he has some of the, maybe not the most underrated or not well known, but it's really dangerous clinches, Neil Magny. You can imagine with his frame and his length and his, you know, just his height and that size in that division, he has some really, really nasty clinch. And I think we're going to start seeing more of that in his fights. So let's go Matt Brown / Neil Magny for that one.
Yeah, Magny's frame is definitely something that you'd like if you were building the perfect fighter, and he uses it very well. So I can definitely see that. And moving on from the striking aspect more to the grappling, whose offensive wrestling are we giving the perfect fighter? Got
to be Khabib, I think. You know, with his pressure, and the amount of takedowns he gets and where he puts you when he takes you down, more importantly in the cage, I think is something that's really underrated, right? It's one thing to be able to take guys down, but if you can't put them in a compromised position once you do so, or you can't take advantage of that takedown, it doesn't matter as much, right? But when Khabib puts you against the fence and figure fours the legs and it starts to work from there, man, what a bad position to be in. So let's go with Khabib.
Right. And this is one that a lot of these, when you see Build the Perfect Fighter on, say, Twitter or Instagram or in an interview, one of the categories you don't often see is defensive wrestling. And I think you're uniquely qualified to answer this, because coming over from pure striking to an MMA gym, you've said in previous interviews that learning how to mix the striking with the grappling and how to add those transitional skills has been a big point of emphasis for you. So whose defensive wrestling will we give the perfect fighter?
Justin Gaethje has some of the best scrambling ability that I've ever seen in the sport. I know a lot of people haven't seen it, in his fights because, he's not wrestling a ton, and a ton of guys haven't necessarily wrestled him. There have been some instances, but his scrambling is absolutely phenomenal. I've seen him, I've seen guys, dead to rights on a shot with him, and he's found his way out of those positions, hips fully committed, and he's ended up on top or back out. So we're going to go with Gaethje for the scrambling ability, and I think we'll probably be able to see that in the next fight.
Right, and then moving on, we have the offensive wrestling and the defensive wrestling. Whose submissions are we giving the perfect fight?
Oh, that's a good question. Submissions. This is obviously not my field per se, so I'm going to have to rack my brain here a little bit, I would say I'm going to go with Demian Maia. Obviously just his jiu-jitsu overall, but having jiu-jitsu that strong and the positions that he puts himself in is going to allow to submit guys, obviously more frequently. So, the whole body of work here, instead of just submissions specifically, it's his jiu-jitsu that leads to the submissions that creates those opportunities. So we're going to go with Demian there.
Right. In the final two categories, both can be a little bit more subjective and it relies a little bit more on the actual fight experience rather than the martial arts experience. Whose heart are we giving to the perfect fighter? Whose ability to come back and spirit are we giving this fighter?
That's a good question. Let me see. Heart. Man, that's a tough question in this day and age. Everyone who steps into the cage has such big heart, right? All those men and women qualify for that. But when you think about someone who stands out consistently, who's been put in tough situations and faces adversity in fights and is able to overcome it consistently, we got to go with Frankie Edgar. He's shown time and time again he's been in bad positions and he's able to turn it around, and having a short-term memory inside of fights and really staying disciplined and pushing forward. I'm going to give it to Frankie for sure.
Yeah, I mean, those Maynard fights were something else. So, yeah, Frankie, no faults there. And then the final category, building this perfect fighter. We've got the fight IQ of Dan Hooker, the boxing of Conor McGregor, the kicks of Edson Barbosa, elbows of Matt Brown, the clinch of Matt Brown and Neil Magny, offensive wrestling of Khabib, defensive wrestling of Gaethje, submissions of Demian Maia, and the heart of Frankie Edgar. The final component is this fighter's chin. Whose chin are we giving the perfect fighter?
That's a good one. Sometimes I think people either take this as a compliment or as an insult, because if you have a good chin, that also means that it's getting tested quite a bit,
That's true. That's true.
Look, man, I'm going to give it to Tony Ferguson after last Saturday, I don't think his chin has been tested like that quite before, and for him to be able to withstand those shots and stay in that fight was really something truly amazing. Sometimes having a chin like that can be a detriment, right? Sometimes it's almost better to go out early and get caught with something clean and not take damage than to take sustained damage for 25 minutes. But, Tony stayed in that fight. He took big shots and he kept coming. That is heart and that is chin, but I'm going to give best chin to Tony Ferguson.
Yeah, the amount of shots and the type of shots like he was absorbing in that fight was something amazing to see. I was watching on a Zoom call with several friends who are more casual fans, and even they were able to see that that's not normal.
It's not human.
Right. Sean, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Your insight and the amount of knowledge that you were able to share has been amazing. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me on, man. Look, I'm glad that Elevation is getting some shine. These guys have been putting in a ton of hard work. Look, no credit goes to me. It's these athletes are getting in there performing, and then it's our fantastic coaching staff. Once again, these 8 coaches that we have on staff that really dedicate everything they have to making these guys and girls get ready for competition. It's nothing necessarily earth-shattering or new or secret, but I think it's just the amount that we care about these guys and what we give back to them really is able to show in competition. So shout out to everyone on Elevation Fight Team, the coaches and the athletes, and yeah, we'll keep this thing moving, man.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.